good? Awesome. Well, I feel like I know everybody in this room, but just in case, my name is Mary Wallace, and I'm the Life Enrichment Coordinator for Independent Living here at Friends Homes Guilford, and I'm excited to present the second installment of The Forum today. The standing for thoughtful, historical experiences, and forum meaning a place, meeting, or medium where ideas and views on a particular issue can be discussed. Here we invite Friends Homes residents to explore each other's lives, professions, and experiences. As we dive into the niches of our neighbors, we encourage open mindfulness, attentiveness, and the will to learn from others. For today's The Forum, it is my privilege to welcome Woman resident Martha Golensky. Having only been a resident of Friends Homes for 2 years, Martha quickly became an integral part of the community through working on the library committee, leading the poetry group, and recently wrapping up a multi-resident project entitled Words and Pictures for the Fox Concourse Art Exhibition in celebration for National Poetry Month. Although she has published work regarding leadership in the nonprofit realm, this self-proclaimed clairvoyant may not have exactly pictured herself published or as a published poet. Yet, through the years, she has been published in journals, magazines, anthologies, and online. This led to the culmination of her first published poetry book, Pride of Place, released in 2018. Today, Martha will be discussing how she found herself writing and leading the poetry groups, how this literary outlet connects us all, sharing pieces of her work, and how we shouldn't limit ourselves when it comes to learning something new. Please help me welcome Martha Golensky to the Forum.
That would be nice, falling over my back. Nice entrance, right? Well, welcome everybody. I'm so glad to see a really nice turnout. You know, poetry, unfortunately, I think is somewhat of a stepchild. I think too many people see it as something esoteric only for a few. That's certainly been my impression when I've had occasion to talk to residents here in the 2 years since I moved in. And when I mention I'm a poet, I get this kind of startled thing, and I say, well, you know, it's something you could do. Oh no, not me. So I guess part of what I want to do today is dispel that notion that poetry is just for the select few instead of something that everyone can enjoy. Doesn't mean that everyone will end up publishing. That is not the goal. The goal is a way to express things that are important to you, and I know of no better vehicle really than poetry for doing that. Back in April, which Mary referred to as was National Poetry Month, the New York Times had an interesting article in which they interviewed a number of poets of different age groups about why they wrote, essentially. And I was struck by this quote from a young 51-year-old poet, youngish to us. And he said, "It was crucial to learn that poetry was about everyday people, places, and things. It was finding the extraordinary in the everyday." And I don't know of any better summing up of what I see as poetry. And some of you may assume that I've been writing since I was a youngster and so forth, and you would be totally wrong about that. I came here to Greensboro in 2007 after I retired from a long career in nonprofit management, both as a practitioner and as a university professor. And I came here assuming I would continue that work, which I did. I opened a small consulting practice here. I joined professional nonprofit organizations through which I gave workshops and so on. And then a very unusual thing happened to me. In 2009, a new friend that I had made here said, "Why don't you come take a class with me at the Shepherd Center?" For those, I think everybody pretty much knows the Shepherd Center is a local nonprofit that offers programs to older adults. And one of their major programs is called Adventures in Learning, where they offer a variety of courses. And I thought, well, I'm up for this. I like reading poetry, and it was, I thought this will be fun. So this was winter of 2009. And I went and took this course, and one of the things the instructor said the first day of class was, while I have selected poems for you to enjoy while we're together, I'm also open to anyone here who writes poetry and would like to offer one of their works for us to consider. And I sort of laughed to myself, and I thought, well, not me. Well, last week of class, Monday morning, I am in the shower when, out of nowhere, a poem comes to me, totally formed. I leapt out of the shower, dripping water, ran to find a piece of paper to write this thing down before it escaped, totally just nonplussed about what had happened, and scribbled this down. And after I finished my shower and looked at it in the light of day, I thought, this isn't half bad. And that was my first poem, which I brought to class at our last session later that same week. And it opened the floodgates for me. It opened something that I had no idea was there. I had, in my career, written all kinds of things. I'd written reports and manuals and grant proposals and anything you can think of. And then when I went to the university, I had to do research, so I was doing research, articles and presentations at conferences. Not very poetic stuff. So here was this sudden change in my life, and after 2 years of trying to fit poetry into the other things I was doing, I gave up my nonprofit work totally. I suddenly decided and realized that it no longer did much for me, and that my interest now was in writing poetry. And I turned my attention totally to poetry. I am basically self-taught. I have never taken a poetry class. I did take a couple of workshops. I continued to go to the poetry appreciation class. One of the things I have found that helps writing is reading poetry as much as you can get your hands on, and just working at it. And in the spring of the following year, I published my first piece of poetry. One of the things that has helped me tremendously was joining a poetry critique group. A group that actually met over yonder in Friends Meeting House for a number of years. That group was growing strong, and it had a number of people in it who were experienced poets. And I benefited tremendously from their feedback. They did not hold back their comments. Sometimes I went home with little wounds on me, not visible, but psychologically. But it always made me better for the experience. And when you write poetry, to me, it is the one place where you're free to be your authentic self, where you don't have to answer to anybody else. You just write for yourself. You write in response to whatever happens to be on your mind at that particular moment. And being in a poetry group offers something unique, I think, and those people, we have a couple of people from poetry group here who will, I'm sure, nod in agreement. It is a place where you can be yourself, where you can share whatever is on your mind in a space that is supportive, and where you get to know people in a way that I don't think anything else offers, because even when you write a poem that is not about you per se, it's still coming from you and expresses something of you, and over time we get to know each other in a way that I have never had the experience in any other groups that I've ever belonged to. So for those of you who sometimes have thought, maybe I'd like to give poetry a try, I certainly would encourage you to think about it. Come join our hearty band of poets here, and see what you think. You can always come to try it out, and if it doesn't fit you, you can always go on, but at least you know that you gave yourself that opportunity. And you may, like me, find a new focus in life that you never anticipated. I often wonder if I had discovered my gift for poetry earlier on in life, what career path might I have followed instead of the one I took? And of course, it doesn't do me much good to look back and to have regrets about that. But what it has made me feel is that in the time that I have here, I'm going to use every opportunity to practice my craft, to perfect it, to get the joy out of it, and to just be the best poet I can make of myself. So I thought one of the things I could share with you is to read some of my poetry that would give you kind of an idea of the breadth of poetry. I think that's the other thing that, if you took a high school class in English, you probably have a very narrow view of poetry and poets, very traditional, and so forth. What I love about poetry is it's the opportunity to visit any subject that you have an interest in, to explore any feeling you have, everything that might affect you in your life or in the people around you, and you get to write about it. I have found times that I've written poems that will never see any light of day to anyone else but me. It's the cheapest form of therapy that I know of. So there is that. That's to keep in mind. Sometimes you just write for yourself. I've been lucky that I have had opportunities to share my work with a broader audience. But that's not why I do it. I don't do it for publishing. The publishing is kind of a benefit after the fact, or a way of my testing myself to see if I'm any good, to put it before a totally unbiased audience and see how I stack up against the competition. So if I publish a couple a year or 2 or 3 a year, that's fine. I am not chasing the glory, certainly. So let me share some of my poetry with you that I thought you might enjoy. And I picked these out from both my book that Mary referenced, Pride of Place, which was kind of the culmination for me of this first leg of my journey, that I was able to put together a whole collection of some 75 poems, which is really a kind of chronology of my life in poetry, tracing it from my early days up through here, my most recent days. But it's really a book about memories. So we'll come to a couple of examples of that shortly. One thing I need to make clear that I find always is confusing to people. A lot of poetry, perhaps the majority of poetry, is written in the first person. And people sometimes assume if it's written in the first person, it has to be about you and it has to be true. No, it doesn't at all. You have to distinguish between the poet and the narrator. The narrator is the eye of a poem. And some pundit once said that the poet and the narrator are not the same, but the narrator knows a heck of a lot about the poet. So yes, you will find pieces of your own life in there, but if you want to change details for your own edification or amusement, have at it. That's another thing I love about poetry. You're not constrained. You can write in any style, form, on any subject that comes to mind. So, we can divide poetry into two broad categories, narrative poetry and lyric poetry. Narrative poetry is, as the name implies, where it basically tells a story. And lyric poetry is focusing more on the emotions. In practice, of course, like everything else in poetry, it's not strictly one or the other. You will find things going across. But I tried to pick a couple of examples that I thought were more pure, for at least to show you the contrast. So this first poem comes from my book. And it is about summers that I have spent in Michigan with a group of people who I consider my second family. And before COVID, I had the wonderful opportunity to go up and stay with them for periods of time in the summer. And this is about one of my visits up there, and it's called Picking Blueberries. By the fourth day of my visit, I'm open to something new. Our group of 5 starts out early for McCann's farm, about 2 miles down the road from the cottage. Before the sun gets so hot, it could bowl us over like a row of 10 pins. We sign in at the barn, drive back to the berry patch, white plastic pails in hand. Someone helps me secure mine to my waist with a piece of twine, then shows me how to roll the ripe fruit off its stem between thumb and forefinger in one quick motion. The bushes seem to welcome the pickers, branches pulled down by the weight of their burden, some berries wider than a dime. I choose a full bush, start from the top, work my way through one section onto the next until I've stripped everything worth taking. Our total, just over 13 pounds. I more than hold my own, and I snag a senior discount to boot. Arms weary, we head home, well pleased by the adventure, dreaming of blueberry cobbler. Another item to cross off if I had a bucket list. And here is an example of a lyric poem. And this one was inspired by recent events, and it should be familiar to Carol and to Joe. And it's called Get Away, a Prayer. Give me wings to fly to Happy Valley, where the sun shimmers with healing warmth and a tender breeze wafts all your troubles away. I'm weary from bearing the weight of grief for people I know, though we've never met. Tears shed, steps so heavy that putting down one foot and then the other seems almost too much to ask. I'm of an age to expect life to grow somewhat easier, but like a truffle snuffling pig, sorrow roots me out. So give me wings to fly to Happy Valley. This was after the Texas massacre that I wrote this. That's the other thing that I love about poetry, is something happens that's of the moment, and you can just deal with it through poetry, which is such a blessing. Now I know a number of you here were able to come to our program back in April, Words and Pictures. So you probably remember the term ekphrastic poetry, which is, for those of you who weren't there or who don't remember, is poetry that is written when inspired by a work of art, paintings, drawing, sculpture, or whatever. And this particular poem happens to be the opening poem from my collection. One of the things I tried to explore in my book was the memories that we attach to experiences, the places that we've been, the people we've met. And I happened to one day be at a gallery, and I saw this painting that I found very intriguing. It was of a living room, couch, chairs, lamps, no people. It was just an empty space, and in the back you could see a staircase going up to the second floor. And I thought to myself, this place needs a family. So I ended up writing Bare Bones. To you, it's just artificial space, an empty stage set, absent meaning. I see the permanent print of memories. Clara, the eldest, dancing the conga down those white, white stairs in the peach glow of her first prom dress. The life body of my husband, John, gone 2 years in September, stretched out on that beige boat of a couch, a bit saggy now, transported to England via P.D. James. Me tracing the yellow, red, green swirls of the brand new Oriental rug, the twins spying from the second floor, unable to control their giggles. Tensile strength memories fixed for all time, piled casually in the corners, draped like Spanish moss over the floor lamp. One area that I find very intriguing and would appeal to a lot of us, I think, is conjuring up childhood memories. When I was a young preteen, in the small town that I lived in upper New York State, it was the custom when you turned 12 or 13 to take ballroom dancing lessons. And we all went to the same place, to a private home owned by a rather formidable individual who taught us not only steps, but comportment, the proper way to handle yourself in a social situation. And this poem is called Twinkle Toes. On Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. sharp, 12 sweaty boys, 12 eager girls, the lot of us gawky preteens, converge at the Rutherfords' Victorian mansion, entering via the double-pane side door for our lesson in the techniques and proper etiquette of ballroom dancing. The boys with slicked down hair wearing natty sport jackets, slacks and ties, pocket squares optional, line up along the west wall. The girls in rainbow-hued dresses, nylons with seams, Mary Janes, white gloves optional, follow suit on the other side of the studio. At Mrs. Rutherford's signal, the boys advance, pick a partner with a slight bow, a shy smile. Couples move into a closed hold. A 78 RPM record slides into place. Mrs. Rutherford shows us the steps, taps in tempo on her red tambourine. The same process for each dance, a different pairing required. We twirl, dip at her command. Precisely at 8:30, the class ends. No longer budding stars, every one of us pretending to be Fred Astaire or Ginger Rogers. Just a silent group of dog-weary kids pointing our toes toward home. One of the sadnesses in my life is that both of my parents passed away, I was nowhere close by, and so I did not have the chance to say goodbye to them. In the case of my mother, this was when I was at the university. I was out in California doing important research for my sabbatical project. And this is called Missing in Action. On a cloudless California morning, a Monday, my sister calls. Mother had a stroke, will never wake up. Don't come home, she won't know you're there. So I stay and spend 4 days driving town to town, researching budgets, boards, benchmarks, while Mother, never mommy or even mom, though she'd laugh when I called her boo, lies breathing but not alive. Thursday night, another call. Well, she's gone. I had planned a weekend treat, a visit with a West Coast friend. It gives me no solace. My sister was wrong. I should have come home. I would have known I was there. And this one is back to the summer times with my Michigan family. I did not have children of my own, so it's been a blessing that I get to play grandma of sorts with the 3 children who are part of this family, and to spend time with them and to have been embraced by their large extended family, which is so different from my very small family. This is called At the Lake. The old blue-roofed cottage, dwarfed by its neighbors, hasn't changed much. Memories need no paint. All summer they come here to swim, to boat, to affirm rituals passed down through the years. Multiple generations in messy configurations. Times measured by the young males hauling out the dock in May and back in Labor Day weekend. Surer signs than any calendar. Suppers served on the long picnic tables under the sheltering oaks. The battle of the 2 spaghettis, a friendly contest with a bite. Sissy climbs into my lap, plants a juicy kiss, smelling of oranges and cinnamon, smack on the lips. The casual generosity of a child. For that day, for those hours, I am not a guest. I am family, enveloped in the warmth they take for granted. And I should mention that the Battle of the 2 Spaghettis is based on fact. There were one aunt and my friend's mother, each brought their version of spaghetti, and the family kind of voted on which they preferred by which one was chosen and which one was left on the counter. But it was all in good fun. Okay, relationships, huge category, encompasses any number of things. This one happens to be about a couple on a trip. And it was inspired, I guess, by, I used to drive up to Michigan before I got too old to do so. And there were parts of West Virginia and Ohio that I passed through that were desolate. I mean, all you saw were mountainous hills, no people, not a town in sight, maybe a cow or two. And there you were out in the middle of nowhere. So this is called Destination Unknown. The road stretches out before us, one undulation after another. In time, I lose the sense of place, each forested mountainside a twin of the one just passed, until I have to question why we left the interstate to travel this two-lane bypath, this digression. Where is the adventure in the tried and true, you asked, with a smile I've come to expect that stops just short of smug. It feels like a trick's been played on me, a sour reward for indulging your whim, extra miles of monotony and silence. Later, when you walked out, I thought back to that day and realized we'd embarked on a journey long before, whose end was quite clear to everyone but me. By the way, there's no truth whatsoever in this. That's the other part of that I love about writing poetry. Just made up a situation. So I could be as mean as I wanted to. For a change of pace, one of my favorite types of poetry is lighter poetry, where you can have just fun to be totally silly. And this is an example that was published, I guess a couple of years ago in an online journal, and it's called Deadwood. At 5 years shy of 80, I wish my brain less encumbered by the flotsam and jetsam of trivia, amassed by accident rather than design. I know Yogi's uniform number was 8, Mantle 7, and Babe Ruth 3. I know the words to Emma Lazarus' poem on the base of the Statue of Liberty. I know Michigan is shaped like a mitten, Detroit at the thumb. I know the preferred pronunciation for minutia, in which I'm now drowning. On the other hand, I easily forget the name of the tree that anchors my patio, or the cross street at the shopping center where I'm meeting a friend for lunch, or the item I meant to add to my shopping list: zucchini, peanut butter, guacamole. Instead, I roam the aisles at the supermarket, hoping for a spark of recognition. So while I may seem a perfect candidate to be a contestant on Jeopardy, I fear that's the time my synapses would choose to go on strike. Instead of the responses that come so quickly to me in my living room, I'd be left to ask plaintively, what is, it's on the tip of my tongue. One of the things that I find is really important to do as you move on in your poetry journey is to challenge yourself. I think the only way to grow is to experience new things, and one of the areas of poetry that has intrigued me in recent years is the number of forms of poetry that date back centuries but have been brought up to modern times with a few slight variations. There's something kind of special to be writing something that you know is several centuries old in terms of its form. One of my favorites in this group is called the Villanelle, which originated in France. And one of the things that it also does for those people who say, gee, I used to love poetry when it rhymed, and don't particularly enjoy the more modern approach, which is unrhymed poetry. In these old forms, you are forced to rhyme. It is part of the format of the poem. So listen for the rhyme and the repetition in this poem. And this one is about the day my father died. And I start out with a quote from Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman philosopher and an emperor. And he said, "Time is a sort of river of passing events, and strong is its current. When you died, I was 1,000 miles away. You were still so young, just 59, yet I remember every moment of that day. So very hard not being there to hear you say my name aloud, and I love you for the last time. When you died, I was 1,000 miles away. It was November, but it might have been May. So deceptive, so improper, the bright sunshine. Yes, I remember every moment of that day. The night before, I dreamt of a jittery blue jay sounding an alarm. So clear now, this cosmic sign. When you died, I was 1,000 miles away. Random thoughts, your laugh almost like a bray, the slight droop of your right eyelid just like mine. Oh, I remember every moment of that day. You were cheated of your proper earthly stay, so sad losing the chance to age like a fine wine. When you died, I was 1,000 miles away, yet I remember every moment of that day." And I'm going to end with a fairly recent poem which deals with one of my favorite activities, which is browsing in the library. This is a poem that I brought recently to my poetry group, and they were so appreciative of it that they said, this needs to be hung in the library here. And fortunately, at the next library executive committee meeting, my colleagues all agreed, and it is now hanging in the library on the wall next to where the AV collection is. And it's called Browsing. Oh, joy so sweet. Oh, by the way, it's a Shakespearean sonnet. Oh, joy so sweet for me to roam the stacks, to run a hand, my probe, along the spine of hardcovers as well as paperbacks, until I find a match that's mine. I mean a book with soul that speaks my name with words profound yet clear, explores the heart in ways so pure, so deep I can reclaim what once I lost, perhaps mislaid. The part of me I like to think reflects the best I have to give, to share with those who make my world a place for growth, where I can test the skills so late to come, but full awake. And if by chance the book has aims less grand, I'll read it just the same, you understand. So now I'd just like to open the floor up to any questions that you might have. Nancy?
Would you share your first poem with us?
Yes, yeah, I actually, you want the first poem or the first poem I published?
The first poem
That came to me?
Yes.
Okay. Now you have to understand, this is not the original version. This has gone through a few iterations. Let me Sometimes I wish I had stayed with the original version, but I did not. So, okay. This was about the house that I lived in when I was in Michigan, which was a lovely Victorian Tudor house. And it's called The House on the Corner. Tudor elegant, she lets me share her history. Dignity intact, red brick still jaunty, then add my own for 10 years, a legacy for the next owner. A crab apple anchors the front yard, gnarly branches jutting out at random as if designed by Jackson Pollock, softened each spring with a blanket of snow-white blossoms. My favorite spot, the three-season porch, fills the blank canvas in the back. Here I repair after work from the first warmth until late fall to survey my private domain, starting with the free-form patio, flagstones in earth tones artfully framed by multi-hued, astilbe, variegated hosta and Japanese painted ferns that now dominates one end of the large yard. But inevitably, my eyes are drawn across the lush lawn to this landscape's masterpiece, a waterfall meandering down a granite rock face into a small pool, a fitting composition of nature and artifice. As the sun loses its final grasp and slips behind the distant hill, a last look around at shapes turned dark, mysterious, never ceasing to appreciate the siren charm of this graceful old place. Other questions? Surely you must have questions. No? Well, Mary, you have a question?
I'll have a microphone so I don't have to talk so loudly. From one used to be more active poet to a very seasoned active poet, what would be your number one advice you would want to give?
Good question. I would try to find a poetry group where you would have some stimulation and encouragement to write. I would take a class, if I could find one, or a workshop. That basically, I think, the two things I would recommend. And just write, and that's the other thing, is just write. Put aside some time, whether it's once a week, every day, whenever your schedule permits, and let that be nothing else but writing time. And if nothing comes at first, that's okay, because you've got to start getting those muscles back in shape, and it takes a while. Yes, Carol?
Who is your favorite poet?
Who is my favorite poet? Ooh, that's a hard one.
Or
Favorite poets, plural? Okay. I guess one of my favorites is Billy Collins. If you don't know who Billy Collins is, a contemporary writer. He's one of the few writers who can make a living as a poet based on his publications and his presentations and so forth. What I like about his poetry is its accessibility. He is of a particular group of poets who believes that you should not have to work hard to understand the meaning of a poem. I absolutely am turned off by reading some of the poetry like you find in the New Yorker, for example, that is written with, as my writing instructor back in college used to say, with pen in hand. You know, there is something, deliberately arty about the writing, and while it apparently meets the criteria for a publication like that, you have to sit and wonder what the heck is this about. So Billy Collins is one. I would say the late Mary Oliver was one of my favorites, still is, and thank God we have a lot of publications by her that are available both online and in bookstores. And what I liked about Mary Oliver, she was, I would say, of the Billy Collins school, in that her work was very accessible to anybody. But she had her own unique voice. I think that's one of the things that you want to strive for as a poet, to establish your own voice so that it's a bit different from anyone else's. And you could always tell a Mary Oliver poem. So I guess those probably come to mind. There are a lot of other ones. There's a woman called Linda Pashtan that probably isn't known to a lot of you unless you're an avid poet. Bless her heart, she's 89 and still writing. And her poetry is different. She's from the East Coast, and it's kind of East Coast poetry. There's a little bit of a sharp edge in some of her poems, but it's brilliant stuff, and I always enjoy a Linda Pashtan poem. So, yeah.
What would you say about protest poetry or performance poetry, or the whole category that many black poets fall into, the street poetry?
Yes.
That's those forms of poetry. I'm not a poet. I would like to be able to spend more time pondering, but I can't imagine myself writing that type of poetry.
It is very much a younger person's form of poetry. Performance poetry has definitely become in vogue for the 20-year-old set, and a lot of them like to participate in poetry slams, which are contests where they come together and they memorize their poems. You cannot read a poem in one of these, and you actually perform it. You act it out. You read it with great flair, and there are quite ample prizes to be won from this kind of contest. Again, it just doesn't speak to me. The New York Times in the past several years has had a poetry column every Sunday in the magazine section, and different people edit this, and depending on the editor's taste, you get poetry of the Billy Collins type, or you get poetry of the kind you're talking about. And a lot of times with the latter, it just doesn't do anything for me. I read it and I try to glean what the person is trying to accomplish, but the forms are often deliberately very haphazard. The images are often very disturbing. Sex is a common theme in a lot of this poetry. And I was surprised in the state-old New York Times recently, there was a poem that ended with a swear word, which really surprised me that got by the editors and was approved. And the thing that, for me, I don't see the need. I don't see the need to do that, except to startle or to speak to that small group of people like yourself. I find the same thing is true often with journals or magazines that are written for the college, in colleges and for college age, that they are often deliberately obscure. There seems to be like a badge of honor if you could say only 3 other people in the world understand what I'm saying. To me, and it's probably a factor of age, maybe if I were 20, I'd feel differently, but it just does not resonate for me. Well, thank you all. I enjoyed having our chance to speak together, and thank you for coming and spending this hour with me.